The only sound in the room was the quiet hiss of the ventilator. Dr. Julian Cole stood before the hospital ethics committee, trying to stay calm. His hands were locked behind his back, knuckles tight and white. The room smelled like stale coffee and cold decisions. Across from him sat a row of board members, their faces stiff, practiced, and unreadable. "Julian," said the hospital administrator, Mr. Thompson. His voice was low and final. "It's been 1,095 days. 3 years. The board has reviewed Miss Vance's case. There is no meaningful brain activity. No response. No hope for recovery." Julian didn't speak at first. His jaw clenched. He had heard all of this before. Every word felt like a stone being dropped into his chest. "I've documented changes," he said finally. Her reflexes respond to sound. Her heart rate changes. "There are signs, involuntary responses," a neurologist interrupted. "Gently, not consciousness." Another doctor, much younger, scoffed from the corner. "He's been obsessed with this case since residency. Brings her flowers, plays music. It's a touching story, but this isn't medicine anymore." The words hit harder than he expected. Obsessed. That's what they thought of him. To them. This was just another file, another cold case. But to Julian, she wasn't just a patient. She was the reason he had become a doctor. The reason he believed in miracles at all. "We'll be ending life support in 48 hours, Thompson said. "We'll notify the family." Julian didn't argue anymore. He knew their minds were made up. He walked out slowly, the hallway lights blinding after the dark boardroom. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know who Era Vance really was. 3 years ago, she was at the top of her world. At just 25, she had become the CEO of the Morrow Foundation, smart, fearless, and ice cold. She ran the room wherever she went, her words sharp, her focus terrifying. She didn't care what people thought. Results came first. Always. Julian remembered the night of her accident like it was yesterday. It was after a high-profile gala, where she publicly rejected a proposal for a children's hospice, calling it financially reckless. Her half-sister had exploded at her in front of everyone. "You don't have a heart," she'd said. That night, Era drove fast, angry, her sister's words ringing in her ears. Rain poured over the windshield. Then screeching tires, glass, metal. Silence. Julian had only seen her once before that in a magazine photo. But he already owed her everything. Years earlier, when Julian was just a scared medical student, his mother had been diagnosed with a heart condition. Surgery was their only option, but they couldn't afford it. Out of desperation, Julian applied for help through the Monroe Foundation. He never expected anything to come of it, but just days later, a letter arrived. The surgery was approved, paid for completely by an anonymous donor. He never found out who it was. Not until later when he saw Era Vance speak at a medical symposium. Cold, sharp, confident, but in one moment she softened. She spoke about quiet cases, those with no headlines, no media, just lives needing help. That's when he knew it was her. So when he heard about the accident, he came. And he never left. For 3 years, he sat by her side. He brushed her hair, kept lavender near her bed because he once read it was her favorite. He played music, read her books, wrote down every twitch, every small change. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. Everyone called him foolish. But she had once saved him without knowing his name. And he couldn't walk away. Now, after 3 years, it was ending. That night, long after the hospital had gone quiet, Julian sat beside her for what he thought would be the last time. He pulled his chair close, eyes full of tears. "I don't know if you can hear me," he whispered, "but I have to say this." He told her about his mother, about the letter, about the moment she gave him back his world, and about how, for the past 3 years, she had given him a reason to believe again. He pulled out his old earbuds, the ones he used every day, and gently placed them by her ears. He pressed play. Claire de Lune filled the room, a soft, haunting melody. her mother's favorite. Goodbye, he whispered, and then her hand moved, just slightly. A gentle squeeze. But it was real. Julian froze. The monitor beside him spiked. Her heart rate climbed. Her eyes twitched. Nurses rushed in. Lights flashed. Chaos. But none of that mattered, because in that moment she opened her eyes, clouded, confused, but alive. Julian leaned in. She looked at him, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. She was back, and everything was about to change. 3 years earlier, the city skyline glittered like a promise. Inside the towering glass walls of the Monroe Foundation's annual gala, the elite had gathered. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Waiters moved like shadows through the crowd, offering wine in carefully plated single quotes OEUVRE. And at the center of it all stood Era Vance, 25 years old, dressed in midnight blue, hair pulled into a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place. Her posture was flawless. Her gaze, ice cold. She wasn't just the CEO. She was the storm everyone feared. When she took the stage that night, silence followed. Not out of respect, out of caution. Efficiency is not the enemy of compassion, she said into the mic. Her voice was calm, but sharp. It is the engine that drives it. We do not fund hope. We fund results. The room clapped politely. But no one smiled. People admired her brilliance, yes. But no one dared get close. Era Vance was a force of nature, untouchable, unreachable. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't ask personal questions. And you never ever challenged her in public, except for Celia, her half-sister. Celia was beautiful, clever, and had learned to survive by smiling through teeth clenched in frustration. She stepped forward as Era exited the stage, her tone casual but sharp like broken glass. Another heartwarmer, she said softly, loud enough for nearby ears. You really know how to move a room, or maybe just freeze it. Era didn't stop. Walking. It worked. That's what matters. Celia followed. Does it? You just rejected the children's hospice proposal in front of the entire board. It was a flawed proposal, Era said, not even blinking. Sentimental and fiscally reckless. You had a chance, Celia hissed. A real chance to show people you're more than this. She gestured vaguely at the room, the gowns, the cold stares, but you don't know how. Do you? You wouldn't know kindness if it saved your life. The words hit Era like a slap, but her face didn't change. No twitch, no tear, just silence. The room had gone quiet around them. Heads turned. People leaned in. It was a spectacle now. Era looked at her sister, not with anger, not even sadness, just stillness. And then she turned and walked away. Her heels echoed sharply across the marble floor. She didn't look back. Later that night, she drove, fast, too fast. The city lights blurred through the rain on her windshield. Her sister's words were played in her mind on a loop. You wouldn't know kindness if it saved your life. The rain fell harder. She gripped the wheel tighter. She didn't cry. Not Era Vance, but her hands shook. Lightning cracked above the skyline. And then a slick corner, a flash of headlights. A split-second scream of tires, metal twisting, glass shattering, and silence. When the news broke the next morning, the city held its breath. Era Vance, CEO of Monroe Foundation, in critical condition. The headlines were everywhere. Some people whispered that maybe it was karma. Others just asked if she would survive. No one visited. No family gave statements. Not even Celia. But one man came to the hospital that day. Quiet doctor. Young. Private. Julian Cole. No one knew why he came. He didn't even know her personally, but he came. And he stayed day after day. Week after week. He watched as the news cycle moved on. As the hospital changed staff, seasons, colors. She remained the same, unmoving, silent, unreachable. But he never gave up. He brought lavender in small glass jars because she once mentioned it in an interview. He played music always ending with Claire de Lune. He read books aloud, even when no one else was around to listen. Even when people rolled their eyes, no one understood him. And he didn't care because long before Era Vance became the Ice Queen, she had unknowingly saved Julian's life. Her foundation had approved a grant anonymously that paid for his mother's heart surgery when they were drowning in bills. She never knew. She never met him, but he never forgot to everyone else. She was just a cold CEO in a coma. To him, she was something else entirely. The person who gave him back his family, who gave him hope when he had none. She had never asked for thanks. She didn't even know what she'd done. But Julian knew, and so, when everyone else moved on, he stayed not as a doctor, but as a man who believed that kindness, no matter how silent, should ever be forgotten, even if the whole world forgot her. He wouldn't, and deep down he still believed she could come back, because sometimes miracles don't come from prayers. Sometimes they come from people who simply refuse to let go. Room 304 didn't look like much, just another hospital room. White walls, soft humming machines, the faint scent of antiseptic always hanging in the air. But for Dr. Julian Cole, it had become something else. It was a second home. A quiet chapel. A prison of hope. Era Vance lay there every day, unmoving, attached to machines that breathed for her, fed her, kept her warm. Her golden hair had grown out and lost its perfect shape. Her skin had faded from ivory to pale. But to Julian, she was still her. Not the CEO, not the reputation. Just her. He had never known her voice, never seen her smile. But he had seen her name at the bottom of one piece of paper 6 years ago, the paper that gave his mother a second chance at life. That one act had changed everything. Julian was a medical student back then, just a boy with worn shoes and big dreams. When his mom was diagnosed, everything stopped. They had no money, no insurance, just fear. That foundation grant signed off anonymously paid for the surgery. Saved her life. No thank you letter, no handshake. Just silent kindness. And now here she was, broken, forgotten. The world had moved on, but he couldn't. So he came back. Every day. At first, it was medical. He monitored her chart, took notes on her reflexes, studied her brain scans, but then days turned to weeks. Weeks into months, and then years. Other doctors stopped believing. The staff changed over. Families came and went, but Julian stayed. He brought fresh lavender every Monday morning, placing it in a small glass by her bed. Not because she asked for it, but because he once read in a magazine that it reminded her of her grandmother's garden. He brought her green jasmine tea, not to drink, but just so the scent filled the room. He played music, always classical, always ending with Claire de Lune, her mother's favorite. According to an old foundation interview, some nurses smiled kindly when they saw him. Others rolled their eyes. He's still doing the vigil, they'd say. 3 years. Poor guy can't let go. They called it romantic, obsessive, delusional, but they didn't know what he knew, because even though Era never moved, never spoke, Julian noticed tiny things. A twitch in her fingers when he played certain songs. A shift in heart rate when he read her poetry. He recorded everything in a notebook, page after page. No one else took it seriously, but Julian did. Even when they called her brain dead, he stayed. Even when they transferred her case to another doctor, he came anyway. He wasn't on the payroll for this. He wasn't her official caregiver. He was just there. Always. Until one day. It all changed. It was a Thursday evening. Julian stood in the back of the boardroom, listening silently as they discussed the final decision. The administrator's voice was calm but cold. We'll give the family 48 hours. Life support will end Friday night. Julian said nothing. There was no fight left in him. That night, the hospital grew quiet as the halls emptied. The sky outside turned dark blue. The city twinkled far beyond the window, like it didn't know someone was about to be erased. He walked into room 304 for what he believed was the last time. He sat beside her. His hands trembled as he reached out and brushed a lock of her hair behind her ear. I don't know if you can hear me, he said softly. I don't know if you ever have, but I need to say this. He told her everything, how she saved his mother, how her foundation gave him back the only family he had, how, when he felt completely alone, a stranger changed his entire life without knowing. His voice cracked. You saved me, he whispered. And for the past 3 years, you gave me a reason to keep showing up, to believe in something again. So, thank you for everything. Tears fell onto her bedsheet. Then, from his pocket, he pulled out the old earbuds. The same ones he'd used every day. He gently placed them over her ears and pressed play. Claire de Lune began to play soft. Haunting, beautiful, goodbye, he whispered. He squeezed her hand gently. One last time, but just as he started to pull away. Her fingers moved out at first. He thought he imagined it. But then another squeeze. Firm, real, impossible. He froze. The heart monitor next to her exploded into frantic beeping. Her pulse was racing. Her breathing changed. Machines blinked and buzzed. Nurses rushed into the room. Julian stared, eyes wide. Then her eyelids fluttered. Once, twice, slowly. They opened. Blue, not sharp like before, but soft, cloudy, confused. But they were open, and they were looking straight at him. Tears slid from her eyes. Julian leaned in close, too stunned to speak. She blinked again. Her lips trembled. She was here. She had come back. After 3 years of silence. She had returned, and nothing would ever be the same again. She blinked again. It wasn't a spasm. Not a reflex. Not another false hope he'd write into his notebook and circle in red. Era Vance was awake. Her eyes, once known for their piercing, cold now, looked like a foggy sky after a storm. Soft, unfocused, full of something he hadn't seen in 3 years. Life. Doctor, what's happening? A nurse shouted, rushing into the room as alarms blared. Julian couldn't answer. He was still kneeling beside her, frozen, hand locked in hers. It wasn't in his head. She had squeezed back. She was breathing on her own. The ventilator hissed and clicked in protest, suddenly no longer needed. One of the nurses reached to adjust the oxygen tube. Another checked her vitals, hands shaking. The machines, once dull and quiet, now lit up like fireworks. I think she's conscious, one whispered. Julian finally found his voice. Barely. She's back. But even as he said it, the truth hit harder than any headline or diagnosis could have prepared him for. She returned to a world that moved on without her. The next 24 hours were a blur. Specialists came in. Neurologists. Cardiologists, journalists tried to sneak in too. But the hospital shut them out. It wasn't a press story. Not yet. It was still too fragile. Era couldn't speak yet. Her muscles didn't know how to work. Her eyes flickered, tracking lights and shadows, sometimes finding Julian and holding there for seconds before fading away. But the signs were real. A miracle, the nurses said quietly. Something you only read about in books. Some of them cried. Some simply stared in stunned silence. Julian never left her side. They moved her to a high observation room. Clean walls. No windows. Controlled lighting. Safer. He sat there again like always, but this time everything was different. She was breathing. She was blinking. She was here, but her eyes didn't recognize him yet. Not fully, and he didn't expect them to. The human brain doesn't just come back after 3 years. Muscles forget, nerves panic. Memory fractures into pieces. Waking up wasn't magic. It was war. That night, Julian walked the empty hallway, unsure what he was feeling. Joy? Yes. But also fear. It had taken 3 years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, it felt terrifying. Would she remember? Her name, her life, her sister, her job? Would she remember anything at all? Would she even want to? He stopped at the end of the corridor, staring out at the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, people were still calling her ruthless. Some still believed she deserved what happened, and others probably had forgotten her altogether. But not him. Never him. Behind him, a voice called quietly, "Doctor." Julian turned. It was Maria, the night nurse, older, kind-eyed. The kind of woman who carried other people's grief like it was her own. "They're transferring her to rehab," she said gently, "starting tomorrow. She'll need round-the-clock care." Julian nodded. Maria hesitated, then smiled, almost sadly. "They say what you did, staying all that time, it wasn't logical." "Wasn't medical?" He smiled faintly. "They said I was obsessed." She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't obsessed, son. You were in love. And maybe that's the only reason she came back." Julian didn't answer. Because she was right. But love wasn't something he had planned. It wasn't romance. It wasn't flowers and perfect moments. It was sitting in silence for 3 years, reading stories to a woman who couldn't answer. It was lavender and tea, and a song played every night. Just in case. It was faith, quiet and aching and stubborn. And now she was here. Maybe broken. Maybe confused. But alive. The next morning, as the nurses carefully prepared to move Era, Julian stood at the side of her bed, holding the rails tightly, her eyes open slowly, tracking the movement. They locked on him for a second. Clearer than yesterday. Still tired. Still foggy, but she didn't look away. He leaned in gently. "Good morning," he whispered, barely holding back the emotion in his throat. Her lips parted slightly. She made a sound, breathy and thin, but unmistakable. A whisper. "Who?" He smiled, and this time it wasn't sad. "Just someone who waited." She stared at him for a long time. Her brows furrowed, not in fear but in confusion. The kind that comes when you're trying to climb out of a deep hole with no memory of how you fell in. And then, just before the nurse wheeled her away, Era lifted her fingers. She didn't say anything else, but she reached for his hand. It wasn't strength. It wasn't clarity. It was trust. The smallest gesture. But for Julian, it meant everything. Waking up wasn't a miracle. Not the kind people imagine. It wasn't sudden joy or celebration. It wasn't a perfect, tearful reunion. For Era Vance, it was a nightmare. A slow, disorienting climb out of darkness into a body she didn't recognize. And a world she no longer understood. Her first clear memory after waking was pain. Sharp. Relentless. Everywhere. Her muscles had wasted away during the coma. Her limbs were thin, her fingers weak, her back stiff. Even breathing on her own felt like lifting bricks. She couldn't sit up without help. Couldn't swallow without choking. Couldn't even cry without feeling like she was breaking apart. But the worst part wasn't her body. It was the silence inside her head. Because Era couldn't remember anything. Not who she was. Not where she came from. Not why she was here. Her mind was like a broken mirror, shards of memories scattered, but no full reflection. Her name felt foreign. Her past? A fog. Every time someone said, "You used to be," she flinched, as if they were introducing her to a stranger who wore her face. The hospital placed her in an intensive rehabilitation program, physical therapy, speech therapy, psychological evaluations. Each day was a battle. She tried walking. Her legs trembled after just 2 steps. She tried writing. Her hand shook like a leaf. She screamed at her physical therapist one afternoon and collapsed on the mat, tears spilling from her eyes. "I can't do this," she gasped. "I'm broken." But the therapist only handed her a towel and said softly, "You're healing. That's different." Era didn't believe him. Not yet. She hated the mirror. The reflection staring back at her had hollow cheeks and dull eyes. A stranger. The staff tiptoed around her, polite but tense. Like they weren't sure how to handle her. Except for him. Julian. Though officially removed from her case for ethical reasons, he never really left. He stopped being her doctor. Now he was just there. He didn't hover. He didn't explain things she didn't ask. He never brought up their history or told her what she should remember. Instead, he left her small things. a pot of lavender by her window, a cup of green jasmine tea. Still warm, a novel on her nightstand, bookmarked halfway through, a crossword puzzle with half the answers filled in. The correct ones. He never stayed long. But she felt his presence before he even entered the room. Like a familiar rhythm her. Body remembered, even if her mind didn't. He didn't act like someone who expected anything. He just showed up one evening. After a long therapy session, Era sat alone in her room. Her legs ached, her head throbbed. The nurse had left a small stack of magazines on the chair beside her. She reached for one, hoping for distraction. The cover stopped her cold. It was her, a version of her she didn't know. Cold eyes. Perfect posture. A headline that made her stomach twist. The Ice Queen of Philanthropy. How Era Vance built her empire with steel and stone. She opened the magazine with trembling hands. The article painted her as a genius. And a tyrant. Quotes from board members, donors, staff. She never made decisions with her heart, one said. Only numbers. She could raise $1 million in an hour, another added. But she didn't know her own team's birthdays. There was a moment at the gala mentioned one where she publicly humiliated her sister for proposing a children's hospice wing. Era closed the magazine. Her hands were shaking. Was that really her? Was she really that cold? Was she someone who looked at dying children and said, not cost effective? She didn't feel like that woman now. She didn't want to be that woman now. The confusion, the shame, it crashed into her like waves. She turned off the light and curled into herself under the blanket. And then, outside the room, she heard soft voices. Two nurses. They didn't know she was awake. It's incredible. One whispered, she shouldn't be alive. She shouldn't be able to speak. It's him, the other replied. That Dr. Julian, she saved his mom's life years ago. Approved a surgery through her foundation. He stayed by her side for 3 years. Read to her. Played music. Lavender and tea every single day. I thought it was a rumor, the first nurse said. Nope, real. He never told her. Never asked for anything. Just waited. Era stared at the ceiling, her heart thudding. She had saved his mother? He'd never said a word. All this time, every quiet kindness, every small gesture wasn't repayment. It was something else, something deeper. The next morning, when Julian came by with her favorite tea, she looked him in the eye for the first time since waking up. Her voice was soft but clear. Why didn't you tell me? Julian blinked. Tell you? What about your mother? He looked down for a moment, then met her gaze. His eyes weren't full of fear or pride. Just truth, because it had nothing to do with you and me, he said simply. You saved her without knowing her. That was grace. I wasn't repaying a debt. I was honoring a miracle. He paused. When the world gave up on you, I didn't, because I knew what you were capable of. You saved my mother's life. I wanted to save yours. Era didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out, slowly, and touched his hand, not out of weakness, not out of thanks, but connection, real wordless understanding. Ice Queen was gone, and in her place was a woman rebuilding herself, one piece at a time with the help of the only person who never asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. The boardroom hadn't changed. Same long table, same cold air, same polished walls that echoed every small sound like it mattered more than it did. Era Vance stood at the entrance. Her hand rested lightly on a cane, not for show, but for support. Her legs still wobbled some days. Her balance wasn't perfect, but she had asked to walk in on her own. And she did. She wore no designer suit, no diamond earrings. Just a simple black coat and soft gray slacks. Her hair, now shoulder length and looser, framed her face in a way that softened her. But her eyes were steady. At the head of the table stood Celia, polished and confident. Her posture was perfect. Her smile practiced. It's good to see you up and about, Celia said sweetly. We were just finalizing a vote. A bit above your energy level right now, I'm sure, but I know what the vote is about, Era interrupted gently. The compassion fund. You're dissolving. It? A pause, small, sharp. Celia's smile froze in place. Around the room, the board members shifted in their chairs. It's a financial drain, Celia replied, tone calm but clipped. Sweet, yes, but sentiment doesn't sustain results. You taught us that. Era nodded slowly. I did, she said. And I was wrong. That made the room fall silent. Celia's mouth opened slightly, unsure whether to laugh or glare. I'm sorry? She said. Era took a slow breath. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried across the room like something alive. I was wrong about a lot of things, she said, looking around the table. I thought compassion made us weak, that efficiency mattered more than empathy. I ran this foundation like a corporation, and in the process, I forgot what we were supposed to be doing here. She took another step forward, leaning slightly on her cane, but taller now. I forgot that behind every proposal is a human being, a scared parent, a sick child, a student just trying to save his mother. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. You want to shut down the compassion fund because it doesn't make headlines. Because it doesn't scale, because there's no guarantee of ROI. She looked straight at Celia now. And you're right. It doesn't make us richer, but it makes us human. Celia's smile cracked at the edges. You're giving speeches again, she said coolly. But you've been gone for years, Era. A lot has changed. The board answers to data. They don't want sentiment, they want results. Era's hand tightened around the cane, but her voice stayed calm. I know. That's why I came prepared. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a thin folder on the table. The cover was labeled, Project Lavender Q1 Report. I started something during my recovery, she said. A small pilot. Volunteers sit with coma patients and those at end-of-life stages. One-on-one human presence. No big costs. No massive overhead, just people helping people. A board member opened the file. Their brows lifted as they scanned the contents. It's working, Era continued. It's small but real. Families are writing letters. Nurses are reporting emotional improvements in patients. Doctors are seeing reduced stress responses. We even got approved for a university-backed study. Another board member flipped to the last page. There was a short handwritten note from a nurse named Maria. I've worked here 30 years. This program reminds me why I still believe in what we do. Era looked around the table one more time. This isn't about reclaiming my seat, she said. It's about correcting my mistakes. I created this foundation to change lives. But I forgot how to care. I forgot why I started it. And I don't want to forget again. She looked at her sister now, not with anger. Just clarity. You once told me I wouldn't know kindness if it saved my life. A silence fell over the room. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't hide them. You were right. Julian stood silently at the back of the room. He hadn't moved. Just watched, supported. That's what he always did. Era took one last breath. We're not just keeping the compassion fund, she said. We're expanding it. I've already filed the paperwork. And I'll be dedicating half my personal trust to match every dollar it receives. The board murmured. The atmosphere shifted. Celia opened her mouth to object, but nothing came out because the power in the room had already shifted. One by one, heads nodded. Not in fear, not out of obligation, but out of respect. She wasn't the ice queen anymore. She wasn't the forgotten patient in the hospital bed either. She was something else now, a woman who fell, shattered, and chose to rebuild with something stronger than pride. She chose to rebuild with heart. As the meeting ended, and board members began to stand. One older man approached Julian quietly. Mr. Abernathy, the longest-serving trustee. I owe you something, he said gruffly. I was in the room when they voted to pull the plug. I didn't fight it, but I delayed the paperwork by 2 days. Julian blinked, surprised. I read your notes. All of them, the man continued. Your stubborn hope. It stuck with me. I thought maybe, just maybe, you were right. Julian didn't speak. He just nodded, eyes full. We're starting a new department, Abernathy added. Patient advocacy. It'll need a leader. Someone who still believes in miracles. What do you say? Julian didn't need to think. Later that evening, Era stood. On the rooftop of her apartment, the sun was setting over the city she once ruled, and now, finally belonged to Julian joined her quietly, holding something in his hand. A small gift, wrapped in soft paper. Inside was a bracelet, simple, woven from an old frayed earbud cord. A single silver bead in the center. The same earbuds that had played music to her for 3 years. The ones that carry her back from the dark. She looked at it, then at him, and though he said nothing, she whispered, yes, because some promises don't need words, and some love stories begin not with fire, but with quiet, impossible faith. 1 year later, their apartment was full of life. Sunlight poured through wide windows. The kitchen smelled of garlic, rosemary, and something baking just a little too long. There was a soft hum of classical music in the background. Nothing dramatic, just familiar. Era walked in, her cane tucked casually under one arm, grocery bag in the other. She didn't need the cane much anymore, but she still carried it not as a crutch, but as a reminder. Julian stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, humming. He didn't turn when she entered. You're late, he said, without looking up. You're bossy, she replied, stealing a piece of bell pepper from the cutting board. That was their rhythm now, quiet, teasing, warm. Not the grand sweeping romance of fairy tales, but the kind built in the small things, the way he brewed her tea just the way she liked, the way she always left a light on if he came home late from the hospital. Their days weren't perfect. Her legs still ached on. Cold mornings. He still carried the weight of years lost. But together, those flaws had become their glue. Every week, Era visited the rehab center. Not as a patient now, but as a mentor. She would sit beside people in recovery, stroke survivors, accident victims, coma patients who were beginning to stir. She wouldn't offer speeches, just presence. Sometimes silence. Sometimes lavender oil, a paperback, a playlist of classical music. They called it the Lavender Project. It had grown beyond what she imagined. Volunteers across cities, small grants, testimonials from families who had once been ready to give up, and then didn't. She never asked for recognition, and yet people began calling her not the ice queen, but the woman who waited back. At the foundation, she had taken her seat again, not as the ruthless executive she once was, but as someone rebuilt from the ground up. She still made hard decisions, but now they were rooted in empathy, not pride. The compassion fund tripled in size. Mr. Abernathy stepped down and handed her the final word at every board meeting. And Julian? He now ran the patient advocacy department, the one Abernathy had offered that day. It wasn't a flashy job. Most days it meant long hours, tough conversations, and slow wins. But it was the kind of work that made his heart quiet at night. They didn't post pictures. They didn't share their story online. Their love wasn't for show, but if you looked closely, you could see it. In the way she rested her head on his shoulder without asking. In the way he paused in doorways just to watch her move. In the way he never said, I told you so. And the way she never said, thank you too many times, because some things go deeper than words. One evening, Era found him on the rooftop of their building, staring at the city as it shifted from gold to purple to blue. The sky bled slowly, the lights of distant windows flickering like candles. He didn't hear her approach. He was holding something, a small, simply wrapped box. When she sat beside him, he handed it over without speaking. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a bracelet, delicate, handmade, woven from the black cord of the earbuds he had used every night in her hospital room. At the center, a single silver bead. Her throat tightened. These are She whispered, trailing off. The ones that played your music, he said softly. Claire de Lune, every night. She looked at him, eyes wide, glistening. You kept them? I couldn't throw them away, he said. They carried you back to me. She slid the bracelet onto her wrist. It wasn't gold. It wasn't precious, but to her, it was worth more than any ring, because it wasn't a promise made in a rush of romance. It was a vow forged in years of silence, in 1,000 small acts of love that no one had seen. He hadn't waited for a reward. He had waited because he believed. I don't know what I did to deserve you, she said quietly. Julian smiled. You didn't do anything, you just lived. That was enough. They sat there in silence. No fireworks. No grand gestures. Just the hum of the city below them, and the steady beating of two hearts that had survived everything. Distance, time, silence, pain. Later that night, they curled up on the couch, sharing tea and listening to an old record. Scratched gently under the needle. Julian fell asleep with his hand over hers. Era didn't. She stayed awake a little longer. Watching him, she thought about who she had been. The woman who wore armor made of numbers, who thought compassion was weakness, who pushed away anyone that came too close. And now here she was, loved not for her power, but for her softness, for her vulnerability, for the fact that she had been broken and had rebuilt. Quietly. Stubbornly. And not alone. She leaned in and kissed Julian's forehead, whispering into the dark, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And as she closed her eyes beside him, she knew this wasn't a comeback. It was a beginning, because sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with a kiss. They start with a quiet man and a woman who forgot the world until he reminded her who she really was.